some of it here. So normally, so are we supposed to go to about noon? Is that right? What's your understanding of this? That's American noon. So is it about 12? Okay. All right. So
There's nothing in the afternoon, so man,
yeah.
you can read your
Just keep
manuscript.
rolling on. Well, I don't normally do things this way. Normally, I do a lot more Q&A, and I'm totally up for that if we make it all the way through. But I have kind of it's more of a lecture of just kind of working through some of this material from this book. So come on in. There's water. It's fine. So here's the preface of what we're going to discuss. It's the basic concept of applying the past. This is the title if they didn't know up there. Applying the past to preserve the future. So what does it look like to be able to learn from the past, to be able to secure and to preserve the things that we value moving forward? Okay. So we're going to look at that through a very detailed dive into two of the most significant figures of modern history and of all time in writing in the English language, but Winston Churchill and C.S. Lewis. But I think what you'll find is an especially relevant application to certainly all of Western culture, Europe, and with major events that continue to have significant ramifications to our day. So, since I plan to do a lot of lecture, I'll say feel free to interrupt me with a question. So if you can just raise your hand, I'll be happy to stop and focus on that, okay? Let's go. All right, so let's just start. Whenever I tell people that I'm writing a book about Winston Churchill and C.S. Lewis, they always ask the same question, which is, did they know each other? So we'll get it out of the way right away. They did not. They did not know each other. They never met. This may come as a surprise, but these two figures are operating at the exact same time. Churchill is 20 years older than Lewis, but all of these major works are happening in the same place, same time. One of the pastors, as I was walking here this morning, said, Churchill is always seen as a man in his context. Lewis is always seen as somebody out of context. So very few people think about all these major works of Lewis's from the Second World War period. So perhaps it's not surprising that Churchill didn't know about Lewis, though the Oxford professor had really achieved quite a bit of fame and renown during the Second World War for his writings, his lectures. You may be aware that his radio commentary on BBC, starting in early World War II, became his book Mere Christianity, which continues to this day to be one of the most, probably the most successful apologetic text, probably in any language in the 20th century. So pretty significant and still significant today. And so probably it was for this radio commentary that Churchill offered in 1951. Churchill was prime minister again. He'd been voted out of office, came back, 1951, offers to put Lewis forward for commander of the most excellent order of the British Empire, CBE. That's the highest chivalric order below knighthood. So a very major award. Lewis turned him down. I rarely see people talk about this. You'll find it in Lewis's letters. It wasn't because Lewis objected to Churchill's wartime leadership. Lewis was actually a conservative, a Tory who supported Lewis supported Churchill against Clement Attlee, his Labour alternative. But from what little we can glean of Lewis, he really did not like newspapers at all, was not interested in the news, current events. He did support Churchill. But again, why, if they were on the same page, their same political views, why would he decline this major honor? Come on in, Bill. The answer, I think, reveals a really significant difference between these two figures, and still today among the most popular writers in the English language. Well, for Churchill, there was no higher honor that could be bestowed than recognition for service to the king and British Empire. This is really Churchill's religion. With undaunted faith in the British Empire, Churchill's, really more than anybody else, kept the light of Western civilization flickering during the darkest night of defeat in 1940 and 1941. Certainly very dark days across the Nordics. under occupation, Norway and Denmark in particular. And without this allegiance to the British Empire forged in the final quarter century of Queen Victoria's reign in the 19th century, it certainly seems plausible, even likely, that Great Britain would have succumbed to the overwhelming might of democracy's enemies, specifically Nazi Germany. Lewis, though, was different from Churchill. Churchill's highest authority was king and country and empire. Lewis, though, answered to a higher authority. His response to Churchill wouldn't have surprised anybody for what he wrote in The Guardian. It's not the Manchester Guardian, but an Anglican newspaper called The Guardian a decade earlier. Most people don't realize that the Screwtape letters were actually serialized weekly as columns in the Guardian newspaper during the Second World War. So few people realize this. In fact, there is no archive of this newspaper in all of the United States, as I found in researching this book. You have to get it at Lambeth Palace. It's the only place you can find it. Well, as a Christian who was well known for defending the faith in public, Lewis did encourage Christian involvement in politics, but his view was how he observed that religion recedes or ebbs when politics flows or demands. So his concern was that when religion and politics merge, it's really politics that wins. And that was his major concern for turning this down. So you'll read here his response to Churchill, again, found in his letters collected by Walter Hooper. Lewis writes, I feel greatly obliged to the Prime Minister, and so as far as my personal feelings are concerned, this honor would be highly agreeable. There are always, however, knaves who say, and fools who believe, that my religious writings are all covert anti-leftist propaganda. And my appearance in the honors list, CBE, would of course strengthen their hands. It is therefore better that I should not appear there. I am sure the Prime Minister will understand my reason, and that my gratitude is and will be none the less cordial. So, Churchill and Lewis never met, never directly corresponded, this was through a secretary, and swore allegiance to two different ultimate authorities. So what can we learn from exploring their lives and times together? Well, first, simply the fact that they produced their most enduring work when everything was at stake. Their lives, their nations, in many ways their religions in terms of the spread. One way to think about this is that without the success of British arms, Lewis probably becomes something like a Bonhoeffer figure. When you just consider that Oxford was targeted by Adolf Hitler to be his capital, that's why it wasn't bombed, for example. So just think about that. They were writing at a time when everything was at stake, their very lives. There's certainly no chance for the British surrender that Winston Churchill would have survived. I mean, he trained his own family to grab whatever possible weapon that they had available to themselves and to go down fighting, not to be taken captive. So their success was unlikely and maybe even impossible when you look back on this. They're from different generations. Churchill's 20 years older than Lewis, but their careers reflect on the three major defining events of Western civilization in the 20th century. The First World War, in which they both fought in the trenches. Second World War, at which point they both achieved their greatest fame and achievement. And then the Cold War, which both of them also commented on. Both died. This is significant because when they were commenting on the Cold War, there was a sense in which, even compared to the first two, this one was the most likely to destroy the entire world. And when they died, Lewis famously died November 1963, the same day as Aldous Huxley, same day as John F. Kennedy, assassination. Churchill died 2 years later. Both died without knowing if what they fought to preserve, to defend, and to advance would long endure. They had no idea, 63 to 65, what their influence would be. Now, Churchill and Lewis would have been successful writers, orators, and teachers no matter any circumstances. There's no doubt about that. Their gifts were prodigious. Without knowing or even hearing them, their words on the page still transform readers today. But it took some of the worst events in world history to draw out the best in both of them. They didn't draft and redraft their talks and columns and speeches from the comforts of security. Mention again Oxford's target as Hitler's capital. Churchill broadcast from his London bunker as the German bombers began falling across England. If you visited London, it's one of the top tourist attractions right there near Westminster, to visit his war rooms underground. But there was really, when you think about it, what's the significance of what Lewis said in Mere Christianity, or what Churchill was giving in his great speeches before the British Parliament at the time, without seeing how things had developed? Because when they gave those talks, no one would have reasonably thought that what they were articulating would be successful. There were only two options. It was going to be fascism or communism. Those were the two great armies, those were the two great empires, those were the two ascendant political paradigms, those were the two that were fighting things out on the Eastern Front. That was really the focus of the world's great upheaval. Really, what was happening in Great Britain was, in some ways, a sideshow. You could see that in what Hitler's own plans. He was kind of delayed a little bit by England not surrendering, but the real focus was always on the Soviet Union for him. And just think about this. I mean, that's looked like, you've heard the phrase the right side of history before. One of the reasons that I don't like this phrase is because if you were saying this in 1940, it'd be very clear it would be Hitler or Stalin. Those are the two men on the right side of history at that time. Just think about this. When Churchill's giving these speeches, you have the fall of France, you have the evacuation from Dunkirk, just making a mockery of Churchill's thunderous threats and Lewis's theological treatises. Except that no matter the circumstances, both men truly believed what they said, and they believed that any civilization worth saving, any civilization worth dying for, is also worth living for, and by buggering on in the face of evil. So, let's jump forward then. Spring of 1941. For the Americans are not in the war yet. But for the British, believe it or not, as bad as it was, in the midst of the Blitz that had been going on since 1940, this was not the lowest point of the war for Great Britain. The worst was still yet to come. But anything worse was hard to imagine if you go back to this spring of 1941. Success back then was measured just in survival, just making it another day, until something anywhere got better. But where it could get better was really anybody's guess. There was no seeming hope. Churchill had famously tried to launch a naval invasion of Norway to try to prevent it from falling, and it was a spectacular disaster. In fact, it was the major thing that brought down the Chamberlain's government. But anybody could guess where this is going to get better, but it's one thing for people to guess. It was Winston Churchill's job, though, to figure out. So he didn't have the luxury that anybody else had of just wondering. He had to actually move not just the pins on the map, but the actual people on the map. So Churchill thought it'd be Greece. Focus was on Greece. Dispatched soldiers in March 1941. France was firmly in the Nazi grip at the time. At the same time, Poland's already defeated. War had started there 2 years earlier. Hitler at the same time was making plans, March 1941, to expand the Auschwitz death camp. So it tells you what's happening spring 1941. The seas were even worse for Churchill. He was even more worried about this. The British were losing ships at an unsustainable pace. Really, it was simple math. It was survival, starvation. They were not going to survive. They were going to starve not for lack of food, then first from lack of tools they needed to stay in the fight. Keep in mind, Great Britain is alone. They have no allies right now. Their allies are all defeated or unengaged, like the United States. They're fighting against Germany, they're fighting against Italy, they're fighting now also against occupied Europe, including France. For all intents and purposes, France is occupied, whether it be the U-boat yards, the airports to be able to launch bombers. France is on the other side there. So the Union wasn't exactly an enemy, but given at this time they still had a pact with Hitler, which meant they were definitely not an ally of his, or not an ally of Great Britain. So that's, you got land, you have sea, you have air. Churchill did not see much hope in the air. German bombs hit Buckingham Palace on March 8th during a daylight raid. The Blitz had gone all the way back to September 7th, 1940, but the peak of the Blitz, the worst night, was actually that spring of 41, May 10th and 11th. It was the worst possible conditions. There was a full moon and a low Thames, and then when you have a full moon and a low Thames, you have the worst possible conditions in London. This was on purpose for the bombers. The moonlight would allow them to be able to see all of their targets to come in at night. The low Thames meant that the firefighters had no water to draw to put out the fires. So that's why it was such a big deal. That is exactly what the Germans were looking for, and he was so eager to finally deliver a knockout blow that there were some German bomber crews that night of May 10th and 11th returned a second and even a third time to bomb London. 1,500 Londoners died that evening. The bombs and subsequent fires destroyed nearly twice as many acres as the Great London Fire did in 1666. So again, survival. Simple survival was success in 1941, but we know that survival is really more than just keeping your body alive. It's about remembering the reasons that you're alive. It's remembering why what you're fighting for. It's resisting the invaders on the battlefield, the seas and the air, but even resisting them in your own mind. So Churchill, just imagine him spinning the globe, looking for places he could take the fight to his enemies. Yet at the same time, this is what's so amazing about Churchill. He's still holding court at his lunch table with conversation about all sorts of expansive things. And the same night that he's planning to open a new front in Greece, on March 6, 1941, that same spring, he takes up an argument about how science proves the existence of God. He claimed that since the sun is hotter than the earth, then the earth came later, heated independently. I don't understand this argument, and I frankly don't think it makes any sense. But what was so fascinating is just the fact that he's making this argument. He's the sole leader of the only country fighting on one side of a world war, and he's sitting there at lunch debating how science proves God's existence. So Churchill shows a capacity to fight the enemies of Western civilization on the battlefield while remembering why Western civilization was worth fighting for in the first place. Now, the thing about Churchill is nobody's going to confuse him for an Orthodox Christian believer, certainly not a born-again evangelical. But in our own time, when the pillars of religion and science in Western civilization have been shaken, undermined, as they were in that time, I think Churchill offers us a compelling example of how we can still contend for what ultimately matters. And that you must be willing to defend with your life the values that make life worth living. Go back. You must be willing to defend with your life the values that make life worth living. And what Churchill did was then connect his present, in these very dark circumstances, to the past, so with courage he could defend the institutions that protect our future. I'll say that again. He connected with wisdom from the past, so he could with courage defend the institutions in the present that then protect and preserve our future. So I think Churchill remains a stirring example for those who are really contending for power to control the instruments of war and peace, because, as we see more clearly in the Second World War than maybe anything else in modern history, the person who's in charge can make the difference between life and death, even for millions. Whoever doubt that, look at the contrast between Germany and Britain in the Second World War. So, as Churchill was regaling his lunch guests and hatching battle plans, there was another example for us, somebody who was engaged in a more brazenly cosmic warfare. Same spring, 1941, May 2nd, The Guardian, I mentioned this, Anglican newspaper, ceased publication in the 1950s, ran the first installment of what eventually grew into these screw-tape letters. C.S. Lewis. Since then, this epistolary format has often been duplicated but never matched in its creativity or insight. You're probably familiar with it. A senior devil screw-tape writes to his nephew Wormwood with advice on how to tempt and otherwise misguide an unidentified British man. The idea for Screwtape came to Lewis almost a year earlier, July 1940, just as the Battle of Britain was commencing in the air and along the coasts. And Hitler was planning, at the same time, Operation Sea Lion, the land invasion of Great Britain. Now, it might seem obvious, a little on the nose, that Lewis and Guardian readers had devils on their mind as bombs began to fall on their isles after France surrendered to Germany just weeks earlier. But what's fascinating is there is no hint of Churchillian call to arms against the Nazis in these letters from Screwtape. They still feel fresh to readers almost a century later. They don't strictly correspond to the war's unfolding drama. But, as I mentioned, C.S. Lewis is often seen as a man without context, a man without history. But their setting does matter. Some of the arguments are hard to follow without an awareness of mid-century debates. So, for example, the first letter concerns what? The relationship between Christianity and science. Same thing as Churchill. And here's what Screwtape tells Wormwood about mortals. Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, the Enlightenment he has in mind here, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar, while the familiar is before their eyes. Here's what Lewis means. He's trying to warn his readers that when we're preoccupied with the here and now, with our present circumstances, our growing, our growling stomachs, just think about that starvation campaign there in Great Britain, and the latest news from different fronts around the world, we fail to perceive beyond those senses. We're so focused on our stomachs, we're not thinking about spiritual things. So that's why Screwtape then tells Wormwood to use science, he says the real sciences, to defend Christianity. It actually says not to do that. This basically was trying to say, like, don't use, exactly what Churchill was doing, don't use these real sciences to defend Christianity. Because what he says, fascinating, he says physics might tempt someone to begin thinking about ultimate reality. Like, don't teach them science, because that'll make them think about these things. And keep in mind, physics was different than what people expected of science. Think of all the advances from Einstein in the 20th century, and of course things that would lead to the atomic bomb as well. He says, better to keep humans occupied, I get a little Lewis, keep humans occupied with fake science, like economics and sociology, the stuff of real life. By the way, it's pretty funny, in the last installment, has anybody here read the Space Trilogy from Lewis? Okay. So you may be familiar then, in the final installment, That Hideous Strength, published in August 1945, end of the war, the hapless protagonist of that book is a young sociologist whose public relations work aids in a demonic plan to destroy the world. Lewis, gotta love Lewis, probably never a man of true subtlety, but even during the war, less time to be subtle. And really on the nose of his views here. So think about this, as the bombs are falling on an isolated Great Britain, Churchill and Lewis, for all their differences, share the same goal of preserving Western civilization. Same Western civilization that, through Christianity, had developed the scientific revolution. So while managing a war that he seemed very likely to lose, Churchill somehow still finds time to defend God. And while defending the Christian faith against demonic threats, Lewis interjects his perspective on the proper roles of science. There's some difference though. Lewis was burdened by the dangers of technology without virtue. It was a major focus of his works. A sin that he saw in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but also one that he saw in Great Britain. And that's definitely That Hideous Strength, his third installment, 45. Churchill, on the other hand, was burdened by the urgency for decisive action after the lost years of failed appeasement, the hopes and wishes that left his nation unprepared for a war that they never wanted and desperately tried to avoid. So we're seeing just in this early 1941 snapshot some of the differences, the similarities, and the similarities, I think, point a path forward for us today to renew and defend, if necessary, with our lives, the values of democracy, freedom, religion, innovation, family, trade, with the recognition that evil is real and that good must fight in the way that God calls us to fight, especially through spiritual means, to prevail. But again, we don't fight exclusively against flesh and blood, nor with exclusively our flesh and blood, but also with our minds, our spirits, and from our very souls. But in the same snapshot, we can begin to see their differences. And the differences are a sort of fork in our path of just making us choose which way we're going to go, both individually and collectively. Was C.S. Lewis wrong to scorn newspapers and current events as distractions from what's most important in life? Or did Lewis presume upon the protection of Churchill and others in defending his freedom to speak and to write? Just think about this very simply. One of Churchill's biggest political opponents, Oswald Mosley, was a fascist. Well, there's certainly no way that Oswald Mosley's government would have allowed Lewis to advocate for Christianity on the BBC, mere Christianity. So the politics really matter. Well, with Churchill, you may, if you're familiar with his life, you may know his kind of most famous comments about Christianity in the church. He said, "I'm a flying buttress. I support the church from the outside, not from the inside." Was he wrong from not becoming a pillar of Christian faith himself? Could he see that Western civilization could be saved from the outside through arms against fascism and communism, but still lost on the inside by the corrosion of unbelief? Because it was not a generic God, but the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose commandments to protect human rights built Western civilization and became the arguments against various pretenders to God's throne, all the way from Babylon to Berlin. It's not some generic concept, but the very specific God of the patriarchs through Jesus Christ to our own day. Well, in our day, we don't, as I've been writing this, trying to access what it would have felt like in spring of 1941 in Great Britain. Not to mention occupied Denmark, not to mention occupied Norway or neutral Sweden or Finland fighting against the Soviets, things like that. I think though with history, we have a major problem of assuming things have to turn out the way that they did. And it's not like back then, you would have talked in early 1940 to Churchill and he would have imagined foreign soldiers goose-stepping down past Buckingham Palace or Westminster, which they never did. But of course, he would not have anticipated that down the boulevards of Paris either, as they did June 14th, 1940. So we don't fear the outside threats as much today, but I think we do perceive that the inside threats feel more advanced and even existential. A Western civilization that has really lost confidence in itself, in the ability to teach the origin and importance of our values, let alone to advocate for them. Across many Western nations, especially in Europe and the Commonwealth of Nations, Christianity has declined to a marginal adherence and relevance at best. And the decline of Christianity and this lost confidence in Western civilization definitely go hand in hand. Churchill spoke of Christianity in more perfunctory ways, like the U.S. president automatically invokes "God bless America." But even if he did, he still spoke better than he knew, because he rightly told the House of Commons, June 18, 1940, at the outset of the Battle of Britain, "Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire." But without that continuity from Christianity, how exactly would Britain justify the cost of resistance to fascism or to communism? To what beyond tradition would British institutions appeal to as their justification, as their grounds of authority? And that's the problem that we perceive today. Where do any of these beliefs come from? Where do any of these values come from? What supports them? Can human rights dangle in the air, unsupported by the foundation of divine compulsion? Does every religion, in the end, place the same value on defending minority rights, protecting the vulnerable, and providing for the weak? And the simple answer is no, definitely not. So, in this experience that we have today, where the outside threats are not don't feel as imminent, but the inside threats, kind of lost confidence in who we are, feel more pressing. I find that the similarities between Churchill and Lewis tell us about kind of where we ought to focus today. So there's two aspects that I want to focus on here. I stand up first. This is really important that clicked as I was studying these two men. We have to be willing to be unpopular today if we're going to be right. We've got to be willing to be unpopular if we're going to be right. Now, it's definitely not the case that you'll be right if you're unpopular. That's not necessarily the case at all. Any would-be fascist or communist or authoritarian can rail against the powers. It's that the visionaries with moral clarity will often be derided or ignored in an immoral or confused age. Think about this from that Churchill and Lewis. Before they came to power and influence in the 1940s, they had to pass through the wilderness of the 1930s. Churchill may have been the only man who could save Great Britain in 1940, but that did not mean he was popular or trusted when he came to power. Absolutely not. He was a man of really deep, courageous convictions, but those convictions sometimes led him in completely baffling directions. The best example would be his admiration for the crown that led him to support King Edward VIII during the abdication crisis in 1936. There were other ways that Churchill was just considered to be completely impossible. The phrase was just, he was erratic. People just couldn't, they were like, yeah, he's right about some things, but he's so wrong about other things. Edward VIII was the best example. You may know that as time went on, Edward VIII was even holding court with the Nazis, potentially undermining his own family, his own nation, his own empire. Anyway, after he abdicated. Another thing was that Churchill was just completely out with the Conservative Party because they were pushing for home rule in India in 1935. As an empire guy, he was very much against that. And so when he's warning against appeasement of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, they were heard against the backdrop of what his friends considered to be his unstable judgment. And I think his management of the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, when he served as First Lord of the Admiralty, I have a little more sympathy with Churchill there, that it wasn't his fault in the conception of it. Nevertheless, it became maybe the biggest fiasco on the Allied side in World War I. And certainly just talk to anybody from New Zealand or Australia about Churchill and you'll get an earful on that. So that's who he was in the 30s. We remember the man of the 40s. That's who he was in the 30s. Now, there was also other factors. Jealousy of Churchill's oratory, his unique ability to motivate the masses. That jealousy may have prevented some people from heeding his warnings. Certainly his self-confidence could be off-putting, though in his defense, he was not the first vain politician. But the thing about prophets, I was saying this last night in my sermon, prophets are tested by whether their nightmares come true. Prophets are tested whether their nightmares come true. And not even Churchill could have imagined how many millions would perish in the nightmare of what Great Britain's appeasers helped Hitler make come true. As a nearly lone voice crying out in the 1930s wilderness, Churchill was the only leader left with the ability and credibility to assume power in that darkest night of 1940. Only he could rouse Western civilization before that nightmare fully engulfed the entire world, because he was willing to be wrong in the 1930s by sticking to the courage of his convictions. He could, in the 1940s, be used to help make the world right again. They go hand in hand. You've got to be willing to be wrong with the courage of your convictions if you want to stand with them against everybody else. So that's the first thing. Now, let's look at Lewis's unpopularity. He wasn't bound by a capricious electorate as Churchill was. He was more comfortable as a prophet without honor in the United Kingdom. He did not help his academic career by making the unfashionable move to theism in 1929 and then to full-blown Christianity by 1931. He did form close friendships with Christian academics, J.R.R. Tolkien, chief among them in Oxford in this period. But Oxford in the 1920s and 30s did not reward the kind of writing that made Lewis famous, and that we continue to read today. To think about this, only a week before Hitler arrived in Vienna, Austria, April 9, 1938, for his Anschluss, the previous month in March, that's the same time, right before the Munich crisis, that Lewis published his first science fiction novel, Out of the Silent Planet. Again, not the kind of things that would make you famous as an Oxford professor. Because Lewis also disdained academic trends as much as he did newspapers. That's how he was able to bring the British public a spiritual fortitude and perspective that they would need to endure their second global catastrophe in less than half a century. Again, he was not popular, not fashionable, not seen as with the times. That's precisely what made him able to speak into his times. Now, one of those Christian friends he made in Oxford was Owen Barfield. He shaped how Lewis looked back on his own life and history more broadly. And if you know much about Lewis at all, you're certainly familiar with the problem of chronological snobbery. And this is what Lewis explained in his memoir, Surprised by Joy. In the first place, Barfield made short work of what I called my chronological snobbery, the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate common to our own age, and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. You must find out why it went out of date. Was it ever refuted? And if so, by whom, where, and how conclusively? Or did it merely die away as fashions do? If the latter, this tells us nothing about its truth or falsehood. From seeing this, one passes to the realization that our own age is also a period. It certainly has, like all periods, its characteristic illusions. They are likeliest to lurk in those widespread assumptions which are so ingrained in the age that no one dares to attack or feels it necessary to defend them. That is a good description of a lot of things. Certainly it's a good description of Churchill. And pushing back on the political assumptions of the ability, if we just negotiate and give and give and give to Hitler, we'll be able to deal with him. It was essentially wish fulfillment. They wished to not have to fight, so they assumed that what they were dealing with was credible. So exactly the kind of snobbery of the presentism that Lewis is criticizing here. So what you see in Lewis's lectures, probably why he feels like a man without context, is because he's so conversant with the past that he feels like he's a man of every age. You see that his disdain for current events was, maybe a hindrance in some ways, but really more of an asset. Because he was not kind of tied down to what everybody else was talking about in the moment, but he could trace ideas through history, when and where they took hold and where they lost traction. It's one of my favorite things about Lewis. He knew that smart people often get the wrong ideas because they don't want to be seen as different from other smart people. So smart people make really dumb decisions. That's a very common characteristic between both of them. Sometimes ideas are tested and tried and found wanting through practice. They're subjected to additional scrutiny. Some arguments collapse in a heap of contradictions. It's not just that Lewis's brilliance is seen in so many different ways. It's not just that old ideas are good and new ideas are bad. It's that, think about this illustration. It's like history is like a catalog of popular music. The vast majority of songs are quickly forgotten once their novelty evaporates. Just think about Charles Wesley. Charles Wesley is not a great songwriter because he produced 6,000 original hymns. That's not why. It's not the volume. It's that a handful of the best came from him. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing, hark the herald angels sing, Jesus, lover of my soul, among them. They've stood the test of time. History has produced a lot more bad ideas than good ideas. Way more. But through trial and error, history will often sift out the best for anyone who's willing to grab a strainer and to go through history. And this is kind of a complicated idea, but I think it's a powerful illustration. What often the ideas that pretend to be fresh in our day, like fashion, are sometimes actually so rotten that it's been so long that they've biodegraded and reemerged as a weed that no one remembers and they think it's a flower. Okay, let's try that again. It kind of poses, an idea will pose as fresh, as new, as interesting, as novel, but actually it's so rotten, it's biodegraded, it's reemerged again, it's a weed, but you don't remember it, so you call it a flower. That's a lot of what happens with ideas. So Churchill and Lewis were both so deeply rooted in the past that they shared a disdain for popular opinion that really they were very willing to unmask as groupthink, to borrow from a contemporary of theirs, George Orwell. When the Second World War began and he joined the Chamberlain cabinet, Churchill had been writing his history of the English-speaking peoples. So he's looking back. I mean, it's so fascinating. The very moment all these incredible political, military disasters are happening, and there's Churchill holed up writing a history book, a work of several volumes of history. They're kind of eclectic. I don't know how many people are reading them today. Clement Attlee, Churchill's political opponent, quote that they should have been called instead of the history of the English-speaking peoples, things in history that interested me. Probably a fair assumption there. But that's just a point. History interested Churchill. That's a really important point, not just in an abstract sense. History fueled his imagination and decisions with a ready library of analogs for the seemingly impossible array of issues that confronted him in the war. He could just draw on any number of scenarios in his head to know what to do in a crisis. And in addition to these analogies and anecdotes, history shaped both men in a fundamental way that can help us to understand and undertake the challenges of our own time. So again, we're looking at 2 points here. The first is the willingness to be unpopular. The second is the willingness to draw on history. The thing you learn about history is that if history progresses, it's not linear. It may progress, things may get better, but if they do, there are ups and downs. It is not linear. And if history repeats, it's not cyclical. It's not merely the exact same patterns again. Rarely does one step inevitably follow the other, forward or backward. Usually some things are getting better while other things are getting worse at the same time. History warns us from the temptation, more than anything else, to be impressed with our present, and it warns us not to be impressed with people who claim to know the future as well. Because again, one step does not just follow the other or just repeat itself. So maybe I do think though, it's not possible to predict the future, but I will say it's impossible to know the future unless you study the past. So if you study the past, it doesn't mean you can know the future, but if you haven't studied the past, you definitely can't know what's going to happen in the future. So, but knowing the past, it doesn't make anything inevitable, good or bad. We can see, just think about this. Churchill and Lewis lived in unprecedented times. It was Great Britain's finest hour. That's what's amazing about that perspective. What Churchill described as their finest hour just looked like their greatest defeat in the moment. There was no anything obviously victorious about it. So think about this for our own day. Are we living at the sunset of Western civilization? Or are we living at the dawn of a new cultural renaissance? What you don't know. That's the whole point about history. You don't know. Try this illustration as well. To our eyes, it looks like the sun is moving down below the horizon. That's the thing about Churchill. He's mourning how the sun is finally setting on the British Empire. And that certainly happened. And Lewis would see, and we would see much greater decline in Christianity in our time as well, and across the United Kingdom for sure. We feel as though we're living in sunset. That's what our eyes tell us. We're living in sunset. We see, again, Christianity is in collapse. Public trust in institutions is at a low point. Patriotism belongs to the lower classes, if anybody. Self-reported anxiety suffocates younger generations. Not enough of these younger generations seem interested in perpetuating the human race by having babies. I mean, fertility rates have collapsed. Revisionist historians are now on the internet all over the place, reviving the old appeasement arguments about Hitler, labeling Churchill the warmonger who suppressed Hitler's plans for peace, crazy as it sounds. We don't experience science today as the engine powering prosperity. It's more of the artificial intelligence that's stealing our privacy. And Russia, backed by communist allies and the world's emerging superpower, is still fighting in Ukraine. Some things don't really ever change, it feels like, or they get worse. But here's the thing about the sunset. A sunset's an optical illusion, right? The sun isn't moving, we are. At least we're revolving, we're orbiting it. The sun is holding us in place. The sun is ensuring that every time the darkness descends, the light will return. That's what's objectively happening, even our eyes are deceived. The thing about Churchill and Lewis is that they could not have known they would be right. They couldn't have known if their words would inspire future generations. They couldn't have known that even they would survive the Second World War. They survived one. The odds were not with them to survive the second one. History did not tell them that they would ever wake up from the darkness that they were living in and writing in at the time. But it did tell them, as surely as the earth orbits the sun, dawn would eventually break, and that darkness can never fully overcome the light. And civilization is preserved by the keepers of the flame, those who have received from their elders what they would rather die than fail to preserve for the next generation. That's what kept them alive. That's what kept them going, we should say. Not alive, but those they were keepers of the flame, receiving from the past what they would rather die defending than fail to preserve for the next generation. So we've got just a little bit more here, and a little bit more time. So, what happens when you don't defend? What if you're not Churchill, you're not Lewis? I first taught on this subject 4 years ago at the first conference here in Copenhagen. I now teach regularly on this subject in the BC Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama. And still I devote a lecture every year to one of the most famous pieces of literature in Danish history. And it's a part of this book as well, because the thing about Churchill and Lewis is that because they were willing to be courageous and stand out, they understood history, they were prepared to see what was coming and stand up against it. But we need to see the contrast. What happens when someone also sees the future, but they see it as the complete reverse of what Lewis and Churchill saw? The flip, the reverse image. That person was the Danish novelist Henrik Pontoppidan. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his book Lykke Per, or Lucky Per, A Fortunate Man, in 1917. 1917 is just after Churchill left the trenches in the First World War, just as Lewis is heading into the trenches of the First World War. So, it's not like they would have been aware of it. The book is only one of 12 works of literature inducted into the official Danish cultural canon. Keep in mind that's a 21st century canon. It's not like this was inducted 100 years ago. We're talking about in this century. It was not even translated into English until 2010. That's my excuse for not seeing it until recently.
As Danes, we forget.
Yeah, thank you. On behalf of the current Danes to the expat Danes. Yes, thank you. But this is a snapshot in time from the turn of the century that captures the most advanced and popular intellectual currents before the world wars. And it reveals what Churchill and Lewis saw themselves as trying to push back against. So let me just give you a brief overview of this long book. Fortunate Man, Happy Per. The protagonist is a man named Peter Sidenius. He grew up in Jutland, Tobias is ministering. He's born about 10 years, kind of in fictional character, 10 years before Churchill, a little bit older. He's the son of a Lutheran minister in a small provincial town. His father is described as austere and pious. He's out of fashion. He's backwards in his dress, his ideas. And his son, Per, never fits in. He rebels against his parents before the age of 10. He especially hated their religion. Whenever I'm talking about this novel, I just have to read the quotes. The quotes from a book that is considered one of the most important pieces of literature in Danish history and culture today, because it is the definitive account of how Denmark left Christianity behind. It's the definitive work. Here's what it says. Like underworld trolls, this is talking about his family. They were blind to life's bright splendor and too paralyzed by fear to embrace its beauty. This is this young man's view at 10 years old or a little bit older than the same way. He represents more than just, and again, if you're familiar with Danish history or really Scandinavian history in general, this is the representative novel of what's known officially as the modern breakthrough of Scandinavian literature, with its criticism of tradition and religion. And so what Pontoppidan does in this book is cast a comprehensive social vision that 2 world wars helped to usher into reality. He's depicting a darkness, he's seeing darkness in his family, history, and Christianity that will be chased away by the light of justice and beauty. But there's one catch of how you go from darkness to light in the modern breakthrough. The dark old world would need to be burned down before the bright new world could be built. And I think it is, with all respect to Churchill and Lewis, I think Pontoppidan wrote the most apt description I've ever read of the 20th century, the events that still define our world today. Here's what Pontoppidan says. Perhaps there was no mistaking the need for a terrible rending asunder of the criminal and hypocritical society in which they lived, a vengeful apocalypse that would purge the world in blood and fire. Boy, that ain't the 20th century. A vengeful apocalypse that would purge the world in blood and fire. Again, this is a hopeful vision that from darkness and Christianity, through a purging of blood and fire, we will emerge into light. This is what the fascists taught. This is what the communists taught. This is exactly what happened. But here's what's so fascinating. Who is the character in this book who offers this perspective on the world? It's the love interest of the main character, a woman named Jacob, a Jewish woman, who you could take her character and drop her into the 21st century and you wouldn't have to change a thing about her. She represents a perfect depiction of cosmopolitan humanitarianism, is how we describe it. So again, this character, it's autobiographical of Pontoppidan. He enjoys a personal breakthrough when he leaves dark, dingy Denmark for bright, clean, let's ask the Dane here, what country would be contrasted with dark, dingy Denmark into bright, clean, futuristic, what country?
Today?
Back then, before the World Wars.
Germany.
Germany is the future.
Enlightened.
The German Enlightenment, German culture. What culture did the British idolize? German. Germany was the height of civilization at the time. So listen to this. This is a quote again from this main character per this book, 1917 Nobel Prize. If I actually believed in some kind of divine providence, I would get down on my knees, even in my best suit, every morning and say a prayer of gratitude that I was born in this proud century. A century in which man finally became aware of his all-pervading power and began to reshape the world according to his needs and desires, and in a grandeur of scale that no God could ever have dreamt of. Boy, that sounds like the 20th century to me. Grandeur of scale, all-pervading power, a proud century reshaped for human needs and desires. No God. Yes, he is the one who saw the future before the guns of August fired in 1914, written before World War I. Here's what I found out, though. I didn't know this 4 years ago. The author Pontoppidan lived here in Copenhagen until 1943. This was long enough to see the vision he cast in this book triumph. From the Urals to the Ruhr, Soviet Union to the Third Reich, it all happened. And remember, 2004 is when the Danish authorities gave this book and it became part of the official cultural canon. So what happened? The month he died in 1943, that was the same month that prisoners attacked their captors at the Treblinka concentration camp in Poland. And more than 900,000, almost all of them Jews, died in this camp before the uprising closed it in that same month. At the same month, the war had begun to turn against the Germans Allies had invaded Sicily. U.S. bombers were attacking manufacturing plants in Schweinfurt to Regensburg. The Red Army counterattacked and retook Kharkiv in Ukraine. And this is the part that really brought me down. Same month, August 1943, the Pontoppidan died here in Copenhagen. It was the same month the German army declared martial law in Denmark. Next door was this neutral Swedish government who learned what the Nazis were intending. That the cosmopolitan, successful, wealthy Danish Jews here in Copenhagen that Pontoppidan wrote about decades earlier would be deported to their deaths. And a few months later, before the Nazis could act, Danish resistors helped almost all the country's Jews escape to Sweden. And I think about those people rowing across the strait between Copenhagen and Sweden and wondered if they wanted to hear tributes to the proud, progressive Germany and the necessary apocalypse to purge hypocritical society in blood and fire. So, just to close, Pontoppidan saw the future, just as Churchill and Lewis did. So, how did this Danish writer vision break through while Churchill and Lewis anticipated break down? It's because I think Churchill and Lewis confronted two wrong views of the past. Churchill decried the cost of appeasing Hitler's Germany in order to avoid a repeat of the First World War. Nobody wanted war, but Churchill knew that giving Hitler what he demanded was the most likely way to get war. Lewis ridiculed the pride of modernity, the framing of the past, as dark and as present as light. This is exactly what he railed against, chronological snobbery. And his 1945 novel, That Hideous Strength, is the best example of his pushback to this. So here's the two wrong views that they were posing. Churchill knew that the British people were not worse than their ancestors. That was what everybody else believed. We're not as strong, we're not as capable, we're not as willing as our ancestors to fight. Churchill didn't believe that lie. They could and they would rise to meet this new threat to Western civilization. Lewis, on the other hand, knew that the British were not better than their ancestors, just because new technology had come, because it could make it easier to act on their worst desires. So again, for all their differences, Churchill and Lewis both knew what we must do to keep the flame flickering until we depart this world. And I think their words and example can still help us today, so we won't fear what tomorrow holds. There you go. All right, I thought it would go right up to noon. We did. But anyone can duck out, but if you got some questions, go ahead. Feel free to leave.
It's almost like England, Britain is exceptional at this point, because they were the only country who went to war alone against Germany, purely on principle. They invented Poland, that's not right, we're going to invade you. And they're producing these extraordinary characters. And of course, Britain today is not the same as it was back then. It was a huge empire, and they outproduced the Soviets, and it was massive, right? But was there some kind of British exceptionalism, some unique qualities of British society that made them, American? You guys attacked when you got attacked.
Yeah.
So
it's true, don't give us any
but
credit.
they just went to war on pure principle.
Well, yeah, two things there. My friend Andrew Wilson, who's a pastor in London, written an amazing book about the year 1776. It's really inspirational, Remaking the World a Crossway, title that I absolutely love. He looks at sort of the geography of history. The British were the only ones who didn't share a border with Germany.
Yeah.
That's basically the bottom line. Like, I don't care how courageous the Danes were.
Doesn't matter.
You're not going to defend that border. The Norwegians, they were a little bit different. That's why they were able to resist more. The British, in that sense, share something in common with the Americans, which is that people didn't invade across the water. So it was really that more than anything else. But I think it is fair to say that through the building of that empire, for better and worse, Great Britain did produce some pretty remarkable figures. And produce remarkable figures in both ways, meaning both in literature and also in politics. And again, some people who are capable of some pretty bad things, but yeah, and I do think, if you want to get technical about it in some other ways, I think the Protestantism helped. I think that did produce certain kinds of insights. And you can look back, I mean, we're still reading lots of British writers, no matter where you live as a Christian today. You think of the Puritans, all the way through the 20th century, John Stott, Martin Lloyd Jones, there's other people who lived through World War II, of course. So, yeah, there's something that I think we just credit as God's kindness there, but also grateful for the English Channel.
Wouldn't it also be fair to say that the Brits knew that they would lose even if they won? Because this would, if they won against the Germans...
That's why they didn't want to fight.
Yeah, this would drain their empire, this would fracture the empire, because it would be so resource demanding.
Well, and I would have to depend more on, and it's interesting as an American, our national narrative depends on World War II more than anything else, because it's the moment that we emerged as global superpower. Overtook, exactly. But what's interesting is that when I have visited different American sites on the continent, from Bastogne to Normandy from the Second World War, when I talk to British friends, they usually prefer World War I sites, to World War II sites. Their national memory is a lot more World War I, interestingly, because for them, that was the dividing point. That was the two worlds. That was the old world to the new world. World War II was really an extension of that. You know, when you're talking about went to war on principle, that's one way to look at it. It's also the same way that World War I happened. On principles that in some cases didn't make any sense. And I will give Churchill some credit, though. He did truly care about the Poles, and it bothered him like crazy through the end of the war that the Poles got sold out to communism, which, you know, make them... No, I'll make you guys stay. No, thank you. Thank you. Let's just make one quick point about the Poles. I don't know if anybody's seen this, but Brian Burge is a sociologist in the United States who produces bar graphs that compare and contrast church attendance in Europe versus states in the United States. Because just like saying the United States is very different, like Vermont is different from Alabama. Well, same thing you're talking about Europe, Poland is different from Denmark.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty significant that Poland is different in part because of the role that the church played in resisting communism through that time. There as well, in ways that are different from any other country in there. So sometimes just the accidents, not accidents, but the providence of history will dictate how the church kind of is seen, how the church is viewed, things like that. So,
It's off topic a little bit,
Yeah, go for it.
but I'm just fascinated by your gifting and your mind, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Current event,
Sure,
Charlie Kirk.
sure, yeah.
Could you just
Sure.
tell us what you think
Charlie
and
Kirk?
what's happening and all that, and how you understand it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just in the interest of transparency, it's helpful to say I don't think Charlie Kirk would have been a fan of mine, so I don't want to pretend like it would have been. I would have been one of those people that he thought should have been a lot more overt in my political campaigning for a specific political party.
I'm with you on that.
Right, so I just, whatever nice things that I believe and say, I just feel like I need to qualify, like he saw me as not necessarily a representative person, somebody that he wanted to commend. But I think the most positive thing that I've seen just from assessing his life is the shift that he made in his own life. And I stop and I just think about this. If you would have told me that the most significant political activist among the younger generation in the United States would be somebody who argued for social views that not even most Republicans, certainly not President Trump, are willing to defend, namely anti-abortion and in favor of traditional marriage. I mean, that's not a normal thing. That's not what you would assume. So the fact that he's out there very explicitly testifying to Christ, speaking against abortion, speaking in favor of traditional marriage, biblical marriage, whatever, creational marriage, not to mention arguing on transgender issues. And that's a pretty remarkable thing right there. And then just to take into the obvious there, that Americans, for a lot of reasons, tolerate higher levels of violence for whatever reason. We don't need to get into all those reasons. We're not the only country that deals with this. Like Europe had major problems with political assassinations. So that's what started World War I, right? And so did Japan, which has really sparked their own contributions in World War II. So I hope nothing like that happens. Sunday will probably be pretty determinative. What tone President Trump decides to take at the funeral will probably be very significant in terms of Do we pit this as a right versus left thing, or do we depict this as a fight against people who want to silence others? I can see that going either way.
Maybe both.
Yeah, maybe both. Could be. I'm not sure. But one of the biggest challenges we simply face today, and I've got a newsletter coming out today where I explore this topic. The main divide I see is some people who think that the only way we can get along is if we all share the same geography, ethnicity in many cases, politics. Really, it's an older pagan idea. And if you look at some of the right-wing movements within Europe, explicitly draw on this. And the biggest enemy to that was Christianity. Christianity that created these universal norms. I don't need to get into all the details, but the challenge that came in World War II is that to project peace for the future, Christianity had to be pushed aside to make way for universal human rights. They were not universal, they were Christian. But it was the only way that the framers, the United Nations, everything else could see that we would be able to preserve a world that would not fall into war again by dictating these universal human rights. But they disconnected from Christianity. Well, Kirk was one of those figures who pointed out you don't actually get to keep those things without Christianity. And he was one to point out whether it be religion, sexuality, all sorts of different things in there, that when you lose Christianity, you lose your civilization, it starts to fray. So those are the parts that I like. I would worry of getting back to older notions of solidarity that are more about our characteristics than our shared convictions. The simpler way to put it, and I've done other lectures on this, is the problem of identity in Western civilization today. People don't know where they belong or what they're aligned with. The question is now, we've switched from ideology, which in a good way is Christianity, is universal. In a bad way, it's fascism, well, especially communism, than ideology more than anything else. So we switched from ideology back to identity, and sort of a framing of above versus below, which ironically is the actual ideology underlying communism. Whatever. It's a way to say, I think Christianity, we need a revival of Christianity this is what my whole book is about, that we're talking about here, to bring us back to a solidarity where we can respect each other's differences, but it has to be based in something that's transcendent. Otherwise, it's just hanging in the air. So how do we do that? So we don't want to go back to blood and soil. Those are Nazi terms of reviving paganism. I'm not accusing Kirk of that, but some people want to do that. But we also don't want just these vague notions of getting along. We've got to have something in the middle. We have to have notions that are rooted in a specific conviction. Not everybody has to believe that to be in that society, but if a society doesn't root themselves in that, we lose everything. So if Kirk was on that side, then, well, I certainly mourn his loss no matter what. I hope that's what happens. People recognize if we want a civilization revival, we need a Christian revival. And that's what you see in the UK especially. Ian Hersey would be the best example of that. I hope we see more of that. If Kirk was part of that movement, hopefully it continues without him. But his loss is tragic no matter how you look at it.
Last question.
Yeah.
You can just go yes or no.
Sorry, especially after that long.
No, I don't want to take from other people's stuff, but do you think he is being misquoted or not?
With the bad stuff?
Yeah.
Well, you get two questions there. One is whether he changed over time. He said a lot of things. I have not said as many things on camera as he has, but I've said plenty. And you say some things you shouldn't have said. So, you can see you can piece together different things positively and negatively. Like, you can see, oh boy, why did he say that about race? And then over here you can see something else, you're like, oh, that's the exact right thing to say about race. Yeah. Or he could say something that would be seen as critical about race, but in fact it's kind of just a pretty commonplace conservative view about, say, the civil rights, like Civil Rights Act of Civil Rights Act of 64, for example, something like that. So that's I don't know him well enough to know that. I just know as a journalist, it's very difficult, to have a full picture of somebody who's on camera that much. And I'd be loath to jump too quickly onto any soundbite either way. And not just the vague notion of context, but we're people who are evolving, especially when you've lived in front of a camera throughout your entire 20s.
Yeah, the man was 31 when he died.
Yeah, and he's on camera all the time, at his own choosing.
And in a hostile environment.
Yeah, and he's in a hostile environment, and he puts himself in that environment all the time, so I just don't want to jump to conclusions about that.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Kind of in line with that, so it's coming up to 28, it's a important year.
Okay.
Is it kind of addressing a little bit the Moscow mood, is that kind
For
of?
sure.
that's,
Yeah, I'm trying to basically split the difference, or not split the difference, but try to explore the tensions that we feel. You'll often, in a political environment, in a Christian environment, you'll have two different notions. One is that we need to preserve the church so that we can influence society. Another perspective is we need to be able to preserve the society and protect the church. That's not a new thing. That's been a thing for a long time. You would see some of the Moscow mood is definitely the protect the society, control the politics, to protect the church. You see a lot of other people like this. Eric Metaxas would be a good example of this. That's not my view, but I don't want to be dismissive of it, because historically speaking, a lot of evidence for it. And what I'm trying to get at with World War II is there's some evidence there. Meaning, again, I think the thing about Lewis is you can write whatever you want, but as long as you're alive. I mean, we have Bonhoeffer's stuff, but who knows what he would have written? Maybe we'd understand what religionless Christianity is if he survived passing his letters from papers in prison in ethics. So I don't want to be dismissive of that view, because sometimes we have a very romantic view of persecution that I just don't find historically viable. So you'll hear things like, well, the church always thrives under persecution, and I'll say, I mean, except for Turkey or North Africa, where they all just got killed. So, Iraq, I mean, like, that's not, the church didn't thrive there. And in some sense, I'll hear people will look back and they'll, like what I'm doing here is a timeline project in some ways. I've done this before with the Reformation. And some people will be dismissive of Christian arms and things like that, and I get it. And they'll say, man, did you know that same time that Luther is writing all this stuff, that the Ottomans, the Turks are at the gates of Vienna? And I'm like, well, yeah, and if they won, who the heck knows what happens in Europe? It could have been catastrophic. It's one of the biggest moments in world history, certainly Western history. So I just don't want to be dismissive of that. While at the same time, I tend to incline personally toward Lewis that preserving the integrity of the church and the primacy of the witness of the church in any environment should be paramount. Is that making sense there? I don't know how I'm going to tease that out exactly. That's why I got a little bit of time to write it. But so I'm trying to explore. What says Bill?
You can take all day on this, but even though Churchill didn't believe the Christian gospel per se,
Right.
how would you summarize his belief in Christendom
Yeah,
and culture?
that's a good question. Hey.
Right, I was just looking for if anyone's done with their cups.
Okay. Yeah, there we go.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Bill. The simple answer there is that there's a lot of revisionist history about that. So I specifically quoted him, and you look back on the speeches, and it's Christian civilization. I don't want to overread that to mean an exclusivity. At the same time, the modern historians have just dismissed that as, oh, he meant that inclusively. He meant that to mean Christian and Muslim and Hindu and non-belief. Well, I don't think that's quite right either. So there's somewhere in the middle there where he meant it in a colloquial, common way, but did not mean it in an all-comers kind of, we all coexist, all religions are the same kind of way. So, that's part that I'm trying to tease out in there. And again, I incline more of kind of like the American founders view, which is they were not believers themselves, but they believed that without Christianity specifically, well, here's a quick contrast for some Americans in here, obviously. The founders' view in 1776 was different from Eisenhower's view in the 50s. Eisenhower's view in the 50s was you cannot have a democracy without religion, and I don't care what religion it is. That's not what the founders believed. It was Christianity that they believed was essential. That's what I'm getting at with Churchill. I think there's a little bit of both, but I do think it was more the residual. It's Christianity, and keep in mind, state church.
Yeah.
It's a state church with a king who has to be not just Christian but Protestant. So it's even more specific there, and I think that's fair. But I don't think he meant it the same way that Lewis would have.
kind of a fun question, and
Okay.
let's look at that too. So, it said the same thing about Tolkien in Lewis with Narnia, that it reflects a little bit of World War II.
Yeah.
Would you say that that mentality is in the book? Like, for example, those who are battling,
Yeah.
not believing Aslan's coming back, just we understand the battle, but aren't seeing the.
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not an expert in that to be able to answer, but I was thinking about how did the war shape those writings? But I do think the one thing that I connect back to, this connects to the previous question in that one, Bill, is that they aren't physically fighting as well, right? I mean, there are physical battles in there. There's physical battles of good and evil. There's death, there's swords, all that sort of stuff. I just think in some sense that those novels at least reflect that it's not just a battle of ideas, but also physically. But you tell me how would you answer your own question?
I think he talks about the secret police, and so he definitely is making a connection between what's going on.
Yeah.
And remember, he was the great knock was his logic on the side of truth and good, but no Christ. So I think not Churchill specifically.
Which was his teacher right before World War I.
That's right.
I mean, literally goes straight from him into combat. But go ahead. Yeah.
No, just so the idea that the battle of good and evil, but without Christ is limited, and then those who are really trusting that Aslan comes and will save the day.
That's a good point. And at the same time, I mean, a lot of people attribute abolition of man as one of his more developed concepts of natural law. So he does ascribe to both. That there is a concept of good and evil that's accessible, I think, in a very Romans 1 kind of way. But at the same time, the ultimate battle, well, let's just think about how it's waged. Famously, language and wardrobe is waged through sacrifice, not through pure triumph. I mean, triumph comes through sacrifice. So he is trying to do both, to depict a good and evil. The town, of course, we talk about abolition of man, but also specifically, the way we do it as Christians is not the same. Okay, well, again, I would be happy to take questions forever, but maybe you can stick around if you want. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Collin, thank you for using your gifts. You are real encouraging.
Okay, thank you. I guess there's some booths when I'm working on the book.
I got a lot. Yeah, that's right.
Really?
Yeah.
Take it.
Lord,
kindness.
Christians would have that.
Okay.
Maybe here.
Okay. We'll be here if I don't hear anything else. We'll be here.
Yes, we email also. Yeah.
It's felt that way. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
I just
Really
thought,
encouraging.
I figured you had.
So,
Thank you, Colin.
well,
Excellent.
thanks. Okay, I just warmed the room up for you tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. I also enjoyed the biography of Kellogg.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was a special project. Mainly because I currently have a full-time job. And so it'll take me the rest of next year to write it. And then it's out, then, the editing and publicity process in our year, it's already 27, so probably 28. Though, I guess with a publisher, depending on who it is, they could probably get it out in 27. Probably depends on what they want to do. Election years are not usually good years for books. But this one, they might think differently. So, I don't know. So we'll see. Yeah, I mean, if there were different circumstances, maybe I would finish it more quickly, but right now I just.
Sweet. You've earned your money today. 1 hour and